Bueno, pues vamos a empezar. En primer lugar, daros los buenos días y agradeceros a todos que asistáis a este evento de predicciones que hacemos todos los años sobre la industria española de tecnología, de la información y de las comunicaciones. Tenemos un hashtag, predicciones IDC, por si queréis tuitear. Bueno, pues vamos a estar dándole caña al Twitter, ¿no?, durante todo el día sobre estos temas, o sea que cualquier cosa, cualquier comentario que queráis hacernos, en persona o a través de la red, pues encantados de recibirlo. La agenda que tenemos para hoy es bastante interesante, qué cosa que os voy a decir yo, ¿no? Pero a mí me parece bastante interesante. Contamos con Chris Luis y con Frank Gens, que son, bueno, pues como veis, Frank Gens es nuestro Chief Analyst a nivel mundial, es decir, el máximo analista, digamos, de la compañía, y Chris Luis, que es vicepresidente a nivel internacional de telecomunicaciones y networking. También contamos con todos los analistas locales, ¿no?, con Fernando, con José y con Luis Altés, que luego al final nos hará un cierre, ¿no?, de conclusiones y hacia dónde va el futuro. Como veis, la agenda, al principio lo que vamos a hacer en esa introducción es ver qué pasó con las predicciones que hicimos el año pasado, porque yo creo que es sano revisar lo que uno dice para luego, en fin, ver lo que va a decir al siguiente año, ¿no?, y si tiene sentido o no tiene sentido, ¿no? Aquellos que, en fin, dicen cosas y luego no revisan lo que han dicho, pues bueno, tiene su problema. Chris Luis luego nos hará una introducción bastante general a lo que está pasando en el mundo digital en su conjunto. Como veis, bueno, pues va a hablar de telecomunicaciones, pero tiene más que ver con las TIC en global, ¿no? Fernando hará ya entrando en el bloque de predicciones. Hemos estructurado las predicciones, las 10 predicciones, en bloques de 3. Fernando presentará las 3 primeras, compitiendo por el futuro en un mercado exigente. José presentará bienvenidos al inicio de la singularidad empresarial, preguntarle qué es eso de la singularidad empresarial, porque no sé si está tan claro. Yo os hablaré un poco de valor y de diferenciación en otras 3 predicciones, y Frank cerrará con la última predicción, quizá la más relevante desde el punto de vista de que engloba a todas las anteriores, ¿no? Como os adelantaba, Luis cerrará las presentaciones hablándonos de liderar el futuro, ¿no? Este es un poco el planteamiento del evento. En cualquier momento podéis levantar la mano y comentamos, ¿eh? O sea, esto es bastante distendido, no se trata de que hablemos solo nosotros, aunque suele ser así, pero bueno, si queréis comentar cosas por vuestro lado, pues encantados. Vamos a revisar las predicciones del año pasado, si os parece. Esta era la primera, la incertidumbre se vuelve a instalar en España. IDC pronosticó un crecimiento plano en 2011. Yo creo que en la incertidumbre acertamos plenamente. De hecho, no sé si teníamos que haber hablado de fuerte incertidumbre a la vista de los acontecimientos que el devenir que ha tenido el mercado desde el verano. Lo cierto es que el crecimiento ha sido del menos 1,5, no plano. Por tanto, la damos como errada, a pesar de que yo creo que estaba bastante centrado de que el año no iba a ser bueno. Cosa que diréis, bueno, pues era bastante evidente. Hombre, pues por octubre, noviembre del año pasado no era tan evidente que el año iba a ser tan malo como todos hemos visto, ¿no? Por tanto, la predicción yo creo que estaba bien enfocada, pero quizá la cifra no estaba del todo cerrada. No sé hasta qué punto podíamos haberlo previsto, ¿no? Hablábamos del Chief Information Officer y del Chief Innovation Officer, un poco de transición, esa presión que está habiendo sobre vuestro, digamos, cliente principal dentro de las organizaciones. Esta la damos por buena, creemos que esa presión sigue en el mercado, de hecho se está agudizando de forma ostensible. De hecho hay una predicción que hablaremos luego sobre esto también. Y bueno, hemos traído un dato, ¿no? A principios de 2011, el 60% de los CIOs utilizaban la maximización de valor y la minimización del riesgo de implementación como criterios de elección. A finales del año, ahora en la última oleada que hemos hecho, es el 68%. O sea, el valor se está convirtiendo. Las 3 preguntas eran riesgo, disminución de coste y maximización de valor, ¿no? El coste ha sido el protagonista en los últimos años, desde hace décadas, ¿no? Y cada vez más el valor va ganando protagonismo. Vuelta a las raíces, reinvención de la oferta para crear estrategias de valor. Bueno, os hemos traído también algunos ejemplos de cosas que han pasado en este año, cosas, yo diría, gordas, relevantes, ¿no? cruces de camino para algunos de los incumbentes en sus sectores. Ahí se han tenido que tomar decisiones difíciles, compras, adquisiciones, alianzas estratégicas. La demanda de la tecnología de consumo en eclosión, bueno, yo creo que esto es un hecho, ¿no? Muchos diréis parcialmente subvencionadas por las telcos, posiblemente cierto también, pero hay una parte importante que no está subsidiada por las telcos y que ha crecido de forma ostensible, ¿no? Ahí tenéis un poco los datos, 3 millones más de conexiones móviles en Internet frente a 2010, que no está mal, a mí me parece que no está mal, comparado con el millón que ha crecido las conexiones de PC. O sea, 3 millones respecto al año anterior, es mucho, es bastante. Eclosión y guerra de dispositivos de consumo, una guerra, hablábamos, si recordáis, de toda la batalla en el móvil, de las plataformas móviles, una batalla que no está cerrada, pero que probablemente empieza a estar definida. Yo creo que es bastante evidente, ¿no? Los smartphones y los tablets, los dispositivos, el hardware, ha crecido un 22% en España en el año 2011. Social business coge velocidad, las tecnologías para la productividad del puesto de trabajo. Pues bueno, el trabajo que hicimos hace algunos meses decía que casi el 15% de las empresas españolas tenían implantadas soluciones de social business hoy, ¿vale? Y otras muchas estaban pensando en desarrollar soluciones de social business en sus empresas, ¿no? Es un tema que ha cogido tracción en el mercado de forma muy rápida, ¿no? Para ser una tecnología bastante innovadora. La expansión del universo digital, como sabéis, cubríamos cuánto estaban creciendo los datos, cuánto se estaba complicando la gestión de esos datos, ¿no? El tener el dato correcto en el momento preciso para tomar la decisión y que sirviera, ¿no? Que tuviera utilidad. Bueno, pues más de un 50% el crecimiento de los datos, y si nos vamos a datos estructurados frente a no estructurados, los no estructurados muchísimo más, como os podéis imaginar, con toda esa base de dispositivos digitales generando contenido, personas generando contenido en todo momento, ¿no? La batalla de la nube se consolida y ahí comienza la adopción, ese era un poco el claim que se daba, pues 15% de las empresas españolas, y esto fue por marzo aproximadamente del año 2011, estaban utilizando cloud computing, ya, o sea, no dentro de 2 años, sí, ya, o sea, en estos momentos ya lo estaban usando, ¿no? Y con perspectivas bastante positivas. Luego profundizaremos mucho más en el concepto de cloud y lo que está suponiendo, ¿no? El Internet y el e-commerce, bueno, pues del bajo coste y de la desintermediación, hemos visto este año propuestas de valor muy interesantes. Es un sector en el que hay mucho interés, mucho desarrollo. El negocio en ingresos ha crecido un 24% y hay más de 2 millones más de usuarios en redes sociales en España, que tampoco está mal, comparado con las cifras que estábamos comentando. Y por último, hablamos del nuevo rol de la red, millones de conexiones y redefinición del rol del operador. De eso nos hablará ahora bastante Chris, ¿no? De esa situación, de ese cruce de caminos también en el que se encuentra el operador, ¿no? Bueno, pues en España, en ese Internet of Things, ¿no? En ese Internet de las cosas conectadas, del machine to machine, 2 millones más de líneas en 2011, ¿no? Por tanto, también creemos que podemos darla por buena. Esta es la revisión de las previsiones del año pasado. No sé si tenéis alguna pregunta. Si no, le doy la palabra a Chris Luis. Chris, if you can.
All me?
Yeah.
You sure you want me now?
Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. How do I change the slide?
Yeah.
Clicker.
Yeah.
Which one?
On the right.
This one?
Yeah.
You sure?
I think so.
First of all, perdóneme porque no hablo español. But my English is much, much better. So, what I'd like to do in the course of this short presentation is to give you an indication of some of the ways in which the telecom landscape is going to evolve. And you may think that many times that doesn't necessarily relate to your industries, your particular involvement in the ICT sector, but increasingly it will, because of the convergence of the telecom and the other sectors. So the underlying network, as Rafa just mentioned, the Internet of Things, the underlying network of all the things that we need to connect will have a direct relationship, a direct correlation with the underlying network. Therefore, the telecoms industry becomes very, very important. So the demand side we can accept is exploding. We all use mobile devices, we all use not all, many use tablets, many people use different devices, many things are starting to communicate. But if we look at the revenue in the telecoms industry, this slide indicates to you the direction of the revenue. And I'll give you some specific indications on Spain later on. The revenue is fundamentally beginning to plateau and beginning to decline. So when we talk about the demands being placed upon the telecom network, we have to understand the revenue coming into the telecom industry is going to come down for the basic services. And therefore you see the two axes of this chart, where on the one hand we have to therefore reduce the cost of building the network, managing the network, delivering those connectivity services, whilst at the same time looking for this rainbow, looking for new revenues from new areas. And of course the appeal for the telecom industry is to move into these new areas, such as IPTV, such as unified communications, security. But all of these other sectors, they already have their existing supply chains, value chains, and therefore the revenue that will accrue to the telecom sector will be somewhat challenged because, of course, they're competing with other sectors. So this is the basic equation that we face for the telecom industry today. And therefore, the relationship of the telecom industry to any other sector, be that the broad IT sector or the media sector or consumer or business, has to be built upon this understanding that the underlying revenues, what we pay for in terms of connectivity, is gradually going to reduce. And that there's many stories behind that, of course, but I think this is a very important message to have in mind. The other fundamental change that we see, and you'll see here the picture that we start with traditionally we start with the network at the center because we're telecom analysts, but of course you put the data center into the middle of that now because the data center is the way in which we manipulate and route all of the traffic across the internet or the cloud or whatever you want to call it in the future. So traditionally, the telecom industry has dictated the way in which services are used. So by that I mean the telco, be it Telefonica or British Telecom or Deutsche or AT&T, would build a network, design a service, and tell us as customers how we would use it. Obviously, monopolistic tendencies meant they could do that. What we're seeing today is that the balance is shifting towards the demand side and towards all of these devices around the edge of the network. And once again, this is bringing in other industry sectors. So the fact that we're now talking about mobile devices, about televisions, about things, of course, like smart meters, but also about PCs, it's bringing in other sectors. And of course, the end-to-end solution that you and I would like to use in our business or our personal lives, that is now driven from behind those devices. So it is no longer sufficient for the telecom industry to deliver its quality of service based on that central view of the network. It has to be truly end-to-end, which raises a whole new requirement of what the customer experience is, and of course, what the expectation is of the different components that form that infrastructure. So thinking about the role of telco and IT players in what we might call this extended digital infrastructure, everyone will have different roles. There is an overlap in roles between the telcos, the IT service players, the channels, but just bear in mind the underlying demand is just phenomenal from the point of view of what the customer wants. The implications for the telco in terms of what they have to build to support that also has a knock-on effect on the IT industry and the supply industry. Because, of course, we're allowing for all these devices we saw in the last chart, but we're also now thinking about the data center, managing telco's own data centers, but also working with data centers which are not part of the telco structure. So data centers from the major IT players or the major software providers. This is where cloud starts to begin to play a major role. And once again, it's the overall management of all of these components which becomes critical. So the finger pointing, the blame culture that we've seen in the past, where we had the telecom industry was blaming the IT guys, and the IT guys blaming the telecom guys, we have to resolve those issues. And therefore, one of the major themes that we'll see in the coming year is how we use analytics and the use of all that big data analysis to support, to keep the service running, to make sure we can identify where the problems are within the network. So this requires a major shift in the way that the telcos think about end-to-end management, the role of IT management within the telco organization. And I mentioned the demand side. I think within the work that we do across the world, we can break this into four major buckets of demand. And we've broken out the consumer demand to be the individual view and also the household view. Because, of course, we're connecting individuals and we're connecting households. Of course, then we're connecting businesses, and then that stripe across is the Internet of Things that Rafa referred to in his opening comments. So the demand is unprecedented. But of course, the implication, as I meant in my opening slide, is that the service revenue will be significantly less. So therefore, we have to balance the expectation, because you and I want better and better service, lower and lower price. So that once again raises that question about how does the telco actually build its services. And I think one thing we should make very clear here is that we talk about the mobile revolution and the use of mobile devices. The fact of the matter is that in our households today, we are installing more and more HD televisions, bigger and bigger screens, and we want high quality service on that. And the method of delivery, of course, off a Blu-ray disc player or off other local devices is ideal. Delivery over the network, from a telco point of view, has to be pretty much delivered over fiber or high quality copper. The mobile network will struggle to deliver anywhere near the same quality. So we must think about the coexistence of fixed and mobile, even though in some countries the ratio of fixed to mobile is dramatically different. In Europe, it tends to be 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. In Africa, probably many 10s to 1. So I just wanted to put the services in context for you for the Spanish market. So I've given you here from our worldwide telecom services database a view of how we see the Spanish market versus, say, the Turkish market, which is growing. This is for all services, all connectivity, fixed and mobile. So despite the explosion in mobile broadband, it is not making up for the decline in some of the traditional services from, let's say, traditional private lines in the business sector, so traditional data services. So the new growing revenue of Ethernet, of broadband, of mobile broadband, and mobile voice, by the way, is beginning to decline. And in fact, with the regulatory position here in Spain, where the regulator is now looking at reducing mobile termination rates by up to 80%, that decline will increase. So where regulation is very strong in markets, it's taking out some of the lucrative parts of the market. Of course, roaming rates is one issue, but mobile termination rates is a big issue. And of course, the implication for this, if the revenue within a country market is beginning to decline from those traditional services, then perhaps we will see some consolidation in terms of the actual competitive environment. So here in Spain, for example, you've got players who come from adjacent country markets where they're the incumbents. You know, you've got some local players. So the question is, how many of those will continue to compete in a market with a strong incumbent? And of course, we're also seeing the convergence between the cable sector and the telecom sector. So very interesting landscape in terms of competition in the future. And this chart, I love putting this chart up because this is, once again, from our worldwide services database. What you see here is the crosshairs actually show the average mobile and fixed broadband penetration for the world. So the farther to the top right you are, the higher the spending is for mobile and for fixed. So you could call this the average spending. But also, of course, the size of the bubble denotes the size of the market. So you'll see, as I mentioned before, the high spending within, say, the US, Switzerland, where the market is somewhat dominated by a couple of players. And then you look at the Chinese market, which is enormous, but very low ARPU. So this is effectively that digital infrastructure I talked about, the connectivity piece of that digital infrastructure, across which we will consume all those services, whether they be delivered through cloud or traditional internet or however they're delivered. So this, when every country looks at this, they want to be better positioned in terms of the penetration rates, but also in order to fund that investment in fiber, in fourth generation networking from the mobile side, we have to keep those revenues growing. But of course, the ARPU is gradually shrinking. So it presents us with an issue. One of the success stories, and Frank will touch upon this later on in his prediction, one of the success stories that we do see, though, is that explosion of mobile devices. And what you see here from our Western European market, where we track PCs, laptops, tablets, mobile devices, both smart and feature phone, the crossover point in terms of the explosion of smart devices, which of course generate much more revenue in terms of ARPU on the data side, we've really had an acceleration of movement from the feature to the smartphone. Now, the good news is, from a consumer point of view, the cost of those devices continues to come down. And therefore, we, in our personal or our business lives, start to be able to afford them more. Or perhaps more importantly, the telcos, the mobile providers, have to subsidize them less because, of course, subsidy of handsets is a major issue for the operators. So this is this underpins that growth in terms of the mobile communication. But once again, don't underestimate the strength of the fixed connection as well, because in terms of what we will consume, the cloud, that end-to-end quality of service that I talked about, we need the combination of fixed and mobile. In fact, if you think about the way in which we looked at the devices around the edge of the network, we will move from screen to screen. You look at any of your children, indeed some of us, our consumption habits are dramatically different when we start to move from screen to screen. So that use of tablets versus smartphones versus TVs, and more we see internet-connected TVs as part of that consumption model. So the message I always put out to the analysts around the world is always think of the context within which one aspect of our industry is evolving. So this is fantastic because it brings the PC and the mobile market together, but we have to think that they will connect over Wi-Fi, over 3G, over 4G, over many different services. And as from a consumption point of view, we don't really care, as long as we get that connection. So I think that's very, very important from the point of view of the way things evolve. Within the business market, I think one of the big issues that we see evolving is this notion of unified communications. So once again, it's the bringing together of multiple formerly separate markets into the unified communications market. And I think from a point of view of a CIO within a business, this starts to bring together components which, some were hardware, some were software, some were service. It all brings it together because it's starting to underpin the way in which we carry out our businesses. This includes the social network side. It includes, of course, the OPEX versus CAPEX argument, so which is all good news for the services industry. The technology becomes more and more buried in terms of the hardware, but the consumption pattern becomes much more around the services and the model which brings in the former PBX, the social network, a lot of the messaging software across different connectivity platforms. So there is a major requirement for the integration, the orchestration of all of these different pieces to come together. So you'll notice that a lot of the language I'm using is the same as the IT industry because this is where the two things really meet. And of course the question this raises is who does the CIO want to work with in terms of its partner? Because if all of these things are digitizing and we've got this extended digital infrastructure with the data center, the network, mobile and fixed access, then the person working most closely with you in your business or indeed you in your household doesn't necessarily have to be the telco. In fact, in many cases, it won't be the telco. So the telcos, one of the things that we see in many parts of the world is telcos beginning to look much more closely at their distribution, their channel structure, how they work with formerly IT channels, bringing all of these services together. And it's one of the big focuses for our research in Europe for the next year is how do we see that whole channel system evolving across Europe? Not easy because, of course, it means the people in the channel end have to have knowledge across many, many different aspects of ICT. And, of course, they formerly had one narrow view. So cloud is a consumption model, and I think we should think of it as a consumption model, not just a delivery model. Cloud opens up many possibilities from the consumer and the business point of view, but the orchestration behind it means a combination of different value chains, different supply chains, and the telco has a role in there. I touched upon video because I think it's important to emphasize the consumer side. Consumer is over half of the total telecom market and continues to be a very strong portion of it. We have seen a lot more activity in video, and to once again emphasize that notion of end screen strategies, multiple screens that we will use as individuals and that therefore the service provider community will have to underpin so that we can consume it on our mobile, on our fixed devices, on our televisions and so on. So we consume it the way that we want to consume it, not the way dictated by the media industry or the telecom industry. And we've seen some great strides in the last 12 months. Portugal Telecom, for example, has just broken through 1 million subscribers for its multi-screen strategy service. The economy is struggling in many ways in Portugal, as it is in many parts of Europe, but they seem to have hit a very sort of good service level there in terms of what the customer wants and what they're willing to pay for. So we're bundling these services together. Of course, the implication off the back of the network in terms of management, in terms of video quality, is enormous. We have to get the quality right, because one thing we will not tolerate as users is that flicker, that delay, that poor picture. So once again, back to my point about quality of service and fiber deployment, which is a major issue, and which may well lead to more consolidation within the telco sector. Now, we talk a lot about ecosystems in this industry, and John Delaney, my colleague who looks at the mobile side, produced this, what we call the love-hate triangle for the consumer side. And it's not just mobile, it's also for the fixed. But the point here is that, you know, who has the upper hand in the service in the future? So is it the service providers who provide the network? Is it the people with the devices, the Apples, the Nokias, the HTCs, the Samsungs, and so on? Or is it the people with the content and the applications? Because each of these touches in different ways the end user. And if you talk to different people, they will have very different views. And of course, the importance for the service provider in this evolving telecom landscape is making itself more and more relevant to whoever has the upper hand. So an acceptance, an acknowledgement that it is not all just about the connectivity, it's about that end-to-end and the consumption of business services and consumer services. Of course, the device plays a major role. The interface on the device plays a major role. You know, but of course, that content and those applications, you look at the success of Angry Birds, the success of Facebook, all of these services which are ubiquitous in the world and starting to really leverage that mobile platform. So it's a very interesting issue. On the business side, and I mentioned this notion of the telco perhaps stepping back from always being the prime contractor in a service environment. Some of the work that we're looking at within cloud, within the business segment, actually does suggest that the telco is well positioned in perhaps a retail and a wholesale level to actually bring together many of the services through a cloud infrastructure to satisfy customer demand, but not always directly with the customer. So I really want to emphasize this notion of more and more wholesale, once again the notion of channel and how we use channel to get services, to bring the telecom, to make the telecom services more relevant. Because I think that's the major issue. How do we build that relevance? How do we embed communications into everyday life for our businesses and our and our personal life? Because it should be invisible. You know, if you're using Wi-Fi in here now, if you're doing your email in here now, then you want the connectivity to be invisible. What you as a user are after is that customer experience of getting access to the application or the content or messaging or whatever it may be. So I do emphasize to telcos around the world, it is so important to understand the context within which the services are actually deployed. And I think this, in summary, this really is the repositioning of this issue. Previously, I guess, even within the telecom industry, even myself, I would have positioned the pyramid on the right-hand side and said, okay, what channels do we use to get to these customers? Increasingly, we have to stand in the shoes of the customer, you know, be they small, medium enterprises or large corporates or the consumer, say, and how do they look out at the combination of industry sectors which we all represent, and who do they want to work with? Because we've got the over-the-top providers coming in, using the connectivity that we build. Yes, of course, we can work as a telco direct with the customers, or there's all those channels that are related with the IT industry. And I think there are many lessons that the telecom industry can take from the IT sector in terms of building channel strategies, managing channel conflict, and making sure that the customer actually get what they want in that evolving landscape. So what I've run through there with you very quickly is a whole range of issues, predictions about the way the industry will change. You know, we continue to work on this in all parts of the world, and certainly we're very happy to talk to you about the telecom issues, but we wanted to keep this moving very quickly today, so I'll hand you back to Rafa, and look forward to your discussion later on. Thank you very much. Gracias.